Welcome to Mr. Hutchings History, where the past comes alive. Let's dive into today's story.
Hey there, listener. Ready for a deep dive? Today we're going to explore the Mexican-American fight for equality before 1980. And you might be surprised by some of what we find.
What's captivating about this era is how so many different forces were at play. You have conquest, migration, legal battles, and powerful grassroots movements.
It really helps us understand a lot of what we see happening today.
Okay, so let's rewind all the way back to the mid-19th century. The Mexican-American War ended in 1848 with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. Mexico was forced to cede huge chunks of land that would eventually become Texas, California, and parts of several other states.
And you know, the treaty was supposed to guarantee certain rights to Mexicans who stay on that land, things like property ownership
Yeah.
and the right to keep their language and culture. But in reality, those promises were often broken.
So, there was this huge disconnect between what was promised on paper and what actually happened. Exactly, and that's something that runs through a lot of this history. Imagine being a Mexican landowner and suddenly your property rights are challenged, or seeing your culture dismissed. This is where we see the seeds of inequality being sown.
It's like a wound that just keeps getting reopened.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. And it's crucial to understanding why the fight for equality became so intense.
Okay. So let's fast forward now to the late 1800s and early 1900s. The U.S. is industrializing rapidly, and we see a huge influx of Mexican laborers. They become essential to the economy, working on railroads, farms, in mines.
Absolutely. But they faced terrible working conditions, low wages, widespread discrimination. It was a classic case of needing their labor but denying them basic rights and respect.
And to really understand just how bad the prejudice was, we have this incredible document, an editorial from the New York Times in 1926. They actually talk about older stock Mexicans, people who had been in the U.S. for generations, as different from these new transient laborers. They even go so far as to use the word invasion to describe this wave of Mexican immigrants.
And this wasn't just some fringe opinion. This was published in one of the most influential newspapers in the country. It really shows how these racist ideas were shaping public opinion and policy. And it sets the stage for what would become a truly horrific chapter. Operation Wetback in 1954.
Over 1 million Mexicans were deported, many of whom were actually American citizens. It's mind-boggling how such a thing could happen.
It really speaks to the power of fear and prejudice. And sadly, it shows how vulnerable even legal residents could be when those in power decided to scapegoat an entire group of people.
It's a dark part of American history that's often overlooked. But in the face of this kind of oppression, Mexican Americans weren't passive. They started fighting back. And they did it strategically.
That's where organizations like the League of United Latin American Citizens, or LUSC, come in, founded in 1929. They recognized that legal battles were key to achieving equality.
They focused on things like challenging segregation, protecting voting rights, and ensuring access to education. It was a long game, but they knew that lasting change wouldn't happen overnight.
And what's really remarkable is they started winning important legal battles years before the civil rights movement gained momentum. For example, take the Mendez v. Westminster case in California in 1947, a full 7 years before Brown v. Board of Education.
So they were already challenging school segregation and winning.
Yes. Mexican-American parents in Orange County, California, sued the school district for segregating their children into separate Mexican schools, and they won.
That must have been a huge victory.
It was, and it had a ripple effect. The Mendez case helped pave the way for future desegregation efforts nationwide and set a precedent for challenging educational inequalities.
So it wasn't just about winning one case, it was about creating lasting change. It's like they were playing a strategic game of legal chess.
Exactly, and this victory shows the power of organized, persistent efforts. It also underscores the importance of local activism. Sometimes those small, localized battles can have national implications.
This brings us to another key organization, the American GI Forum, founded in 1948 by Dr. Hector P. Garcia. They focused on the rights of Mexican-American veterans who had served their country but still faced discrimination at home.
Imagine the injustice. You risk your life for your country only to be denied basic rights and respect when you return.
It's infuriating. What kind of things did they fight against?
They took on all sorts of cases, from discrimination in housing and employment to the truly shocking case of Felix Longoria. He was a Mexican-American soldier killed in World War II, and his family was denied the right to hold a funeral service for him at the local funeral home because of his ethnicity.
That's just awful.
It sparked national outrage. Even then, Senator Lyndon B. Johnson got involved. helping to ensure Longoria received a proper burial at Arlington National Cemetery.
So even in the face of such blatant discrimination, there were people willing to stand up and say, this is wrong.
Absolutely, and that's a testament to the courage of these veterans and the power of organizations like the American GI Forum to amplify their voices and demand justice.
It really highlights the fact that the fight for equality was happening on multiple fronts, in the courts, within communities, and even on the national stage. But things were about to heat up even more. As we enter the 1960s, the era of the Chicano movement.
This was a time of profound cultural and political awakening.
It feels like a whole generation was saying, we're here, we're proud, and we're not going to be silent anymore.
Yeah. It was about reclaiming their heritage, challenging stereotypes,
Right.
and demanding their rightful place in society. And this wasn't just happening in courtrooms, it was happening in art, music, literature, all aspects of culture.
One of the most powerful examples we have from this era is Rodolfo Corky Gonzalez's poem, I Am Joaquin. It's like a manifesto for the Chicano movement, full of pride, pain, and determination.
It really captures the spirit of the time, that sense of searching for identity and struggling to reconcile their Mexican heritage with their American reality.
But it wasn't just about cultural identity, right? This was also a time of intense activism around economic justice.
Absolutely. The fight for cultural recognition was deeply intertwined with the struggle for economic equality. And you can't talk about this era without mentioning Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta. They were the driving force behind the United Farm Workers movement.
They organized farm workers, led boycotts, and even went on hunger strikes to fight for better wages and working conditions. Talk about commitment.
Think about the courage it took to put your own body on the line like that. They were willing to risk everything to improve the lives of countless farm workers.
And they weren't afraid to take on powerful interests. They challenged growers, politicians, even the Teamsters Union.
And you know what's really interesting is that they embraced nonviolent resistance as a core strategy.
Yeah.
Inspired by figures like Gandhi and Martin Luther King Jr.
It's amazing how these different movements for social change were influencing and learning from each other.
That's a great point. It shows how interconnected the fight for justice really is.
Okay, so before we move on, I think it would be really helpful to take a step back and look at how historians have interpreted this period. We have insights from four main schools of thought: the progressive school, the social history school, the revisionist school, and the post-colonial school. Each one offers a unique lens through which to understand what was happening.
Let's start with the progressive school. They focus on the economic exploitation of Mexican labor and how it led to the creation of these really rigid racial hierarchies in the Southwest. They argue that the demand for cheap labor drove migration patterns and fueled the fight for civil rights.
So they're saying that the fight for equality was rooted in the economics.
Exactly. They see it as a struggle against a system designed to keep Mexican Americans at the bottom of the social and economic ladder. A key figure in this school is Carrie McWilliams, whose book North from Mexico is a classic study of this dynamic.
What about the social history school? How do they view this period?
They focus more on the grassroots activism, the everyday people who organized, protested, demanded change. They highlight the importance of women's contributions, which were often overlooked in traditional historical accounts. Think about figures like Dolores Huerta. She was instrumental in the success of the UFW, but her role was often overshadowed by César Chávez.
So they're saying, hey, let's look beyond the big names and recognize the collective effort that made these movements possible.
Exactly. And they also emphasize the cultural aspects of the movement, the way people used art, music, and literature to express their identity and challenge stereotypes.
Now, the revisionist school sounds pretty intriguing. What's their take?
They challenge some of the traditional assumptions about this period. For example, they question the idea that military service was a pathway to assimilation for Mexican Americans. While some might have seen it that way, revisionist historians point out that military service often reinforced this idea of conditional inclusion. You're accepted as long as you conform to certain expectations.
So even if you served your country, you weren't necessarily guaranteed full equality.
Right. And they also point out that the Chicano movement was actually quite diverse, with a wide range of viewpoints and goals. It wasn't just one monolithic block.
Okay, and finally we have the post-colonial school. What's their perspective?
They see the Mexican-American experience through the lens of U.S. imperialism and economic exploitation. They argue that U.S. policies and interventions in Mexico directly shaped migration patterns and created conditions that led to the fight for equality.
So they're saying we need to look beyond U.S. borders to understand what was happening domestically.
Yes. A key figure in this school is Juan Gonzalez, whose book Harvest of Empire explores these connections in detail.
It's amazing how each of these schools offers a different perspective on the same events. It reminds us that history is complex, and there's always more than one way to interpret it.
It also shows how historical narratives can be influenced by the perspectives of those who write them. That's why it's important to consider multiple viewpoints and to be aware of potential biases.
So beyond these different schools of thought, we also have some really powerful primary sources from this era.
Absolutely. Those firsthand accounts can give us a much more visceral understanding of what life was like for Mexican Americans during this time.
For example, we had that New York Times editorial we talked about earlier. It's a chilling reminder of the racist rhetoric that was prevalent in mainstream media.
And we also have documents from organizations like LULAC and the American GI Forum. Their internal memos, letters, and meeting minutes give us a glimpse into their strategies and the challenges they face.
It's like we're getting a behind-the-scenes look at how they organized and fought for change.
And then there are the speeches and writings of figures like César Chávez. His words are so powerful. They really convey the passion and conviction that fueled the movement.
One of his most famous quotes is, "The fight is never about grapes or lettuce. It is always about people." It's a reminder that these movements weren't just about abstract principles. They were about real people's lives.
Exactly. And when we read those primary sources, we connect with those individuals on a human level.
Okay, so let's fast forward to 1980. Where did the Mexican-American community stand in their fight for equality at that point?
By 1980, they had made significant progress. They had won important legal victories, challenged discriminatory practices, and made their presence felt in American culture and politics. Think about it. They had helped to desegregate schools, secure voting rights, and improve working conditions for farm workers.
So they achieved some major milestones. But I'm guessing the fight wasn't over, right?
Of course not. Systemic inequalities persisted, and many challenges remained. Issues like educational disparities, housing discrimination, and lack of political representation were still major concerns.
So it's a story of both progress and ongoing struggle.
Exactly. It's a reminder that social change is a long-term process. It takes time, dedication, and a willingness to keep fighting for what's right.
And their story continues to inspire activism and advocacy today.
Absolutely. Their legacy reminds us that even in the face of seemingly insurmountable obstacles, we can make a difference. And that's a message that resonates across generations. And what's fascinating is how this history connects to issues we're still grappling with today.
It's like we're seeing echoes of the past in our present-day debates. Think about immigration. The same anxieties and prejudices that fueled Operation Wetback are still shaping policy discussions today.
You see that same rhetoric, immigrants being portrayed as a threat, as somehow less deserving of rights. But when you understand the historical context, you realize these arguments aren't new. They're rooted in a long history of discrimination.
And the fight for fair wages and safe working conditions that Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta championed is still going strong.
Absolutely. The issues facing farm workers haven't gone away, and their struggle for dignity and respect continues to inspire labor organizers across different industries.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to bring it back to you, the listener. We've covered a lot of ground. From broken treaties and blatant discrimination to inspiring activism and hard-won victories, what can we learn from this history?
I think one of the biggest takeaways is the power of collective action. Time and time again, we see how Mexican Americans organized, mobilized, and fought for their rights. They understood that change doesn't happen in isolation. It requires solidarity, persistence, and a willingness to challenge the status quo.
Their story also reminds us that progress is rarely linear. There will be setbacks, there will be moments of despair, but the fight for equality must continue.
And it's a fight that requires vigilance. We can't take our rights for granted. We have to be aware of the ways that discrimination can manifest, even in subtle forms.
It's like that saying, the price of freedom is an eternal vigilance.
Exactly. We have to be active participants in shaping a more just and equitable society.
So as you go about your day, think about the legacy of this struggle. How can you be an ally? How can you contribute to the ongoing fight for equality in your own community?
We all have a role to play in creating a world where everyone has the opportunity to thrive, regardless of their background.
What a powerful thought to leave our listeners with. Thank you for joining us on this incredible journey through history. Until next time, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep fighting for a better future for all.
Thanks for listening to Mr. Hutchings History. Keep exploring, and we'll see you next time.